Right, here we go, and we're recording, and I'm talking to Lionel Martin in Havana on the 27th of July 1992. Sorry, you're going to say something?
Hello, Andy. I don't know what kind of... are you going to use your name on it?
No. Probably not. But let me ask you, you've written a book on this subject. Was Fidel a Marxist before the revolution?
Well, that's a very polemical question. Many scholars think that he became a Marxist after the revolution due to U.S. pressures. In my book, I make the argument that Fidel Castro did come into contact with Marxism, with socialist thought long before the revolution triumphed, and that he was a Marxist essentially when the revolution came into power. I go back to his youth. I interviewed Fidel Castro. I interviewed his friends. I went through old newspapers, old speeches, and writings of Fidel Castro as far back as when he was 20 years old, and his letters from prison in 1954 and 1955, in which he talks about reading Lenin and Marx and Engels.
How strong was the communist current in pre-revolutionary Cuba? How important were the communists? To resume, how important was the communist current in Cuba before the revolution?
There was a well-defined and important communist current, especially within what one might call the working class and in intellectual circles, dating back to the mid-20s following the Russian Revolution. Many intellectuals were Marxists in Cuba, and the trade union movement was essentially organized by Marxists and by people coming out of the Communist Party, and they were decisive in many trade unions until 1947 and 48, when a law was passed prohibiting communists from leading trade unions in Cuba.
But the communist attitude towards Fidel and his followers, particularly at the time of Moncada, was very negative, wasn't it?
The communists thought that Fidel was pulling off a putsch, which they opposed on theoretical grounds. By putsch, they meant that he was making an armed attack, without having a mass base. Later, the communists said they were convinced by Fidel that he indeed had the idea of using the attack to develop a mass base, that he didn't think that the government would fall because of his attack on Cuba's second biggest army base, that he was using it as a takeoff point to jumpstart a broad social revolution. So they say in retrospect, at any rate, that Fidel convinced them of that. But at the time, they were critical of Fidel, although they said he was a force to be reckoned with, and they seem to have respected him in many ways.
So when did the communists join forces in the Sierra Maestra with Fidel?
The communists did not support the armed revolution thesis of Fidel Castro. They believed that in Cuba you had to develop a broad front, united front of workers to bring about change. And so when Fidel Castro went into the mountains, they did not throw their full support toward him. But there came a time in 1958 when they began to appreciate the importance of Fidel Castro's movement and began to support him, although in a limited way. Fidel Castro, as I said, was essentially a Marxist or socialist-minded, in my opinion, but he certainly did not follow the communist line. He had his own interpretation of Leninism.
And there was a strong strand within the 26th of July movement, within Fidel's movement, which was explicitly anti-communist.
Yes, Fidel Castro's movement was extremely broad, and he tried to bring under his umbrella all anti-Batista forces, all democratic forces in Cuba, and also left-wing forces such as the Communist Party. He was very explicit while he was fighting in the mountains that he wanted the members of the 26th of July movement who worked in the cities and which were part of his own movement to cooperate with the communists. But many of them did not want to cooperate with the communists. They disdained the communists. They criticized the communists for having cooperated with Batista when Batista ran as legitimate candidate in 1940 for president and won.
Why did Fidel never describe himself as a socialist before the revolution?
Fidel Castro was very conscious of the tactics and strategy of making a revolution. And he made a point of never cornering himself by defining his object as socialism. He did say he wanted to bring about a deep social revolution in Cuba. He did say very explicitly that he was against the moneyed interests, that he was in favor of the dispossessed, that he was against foreign control of Cuba's economy, but he never used the words socialism or communism. And he told me that he felt that would be a kind of kiss of death because he felt that the Cuban people, like many people in the West, were essentially educated as anti-communists, and they would have swerved away from his movement if he had labeled it. So he never labeled his movement, but he always had in mind a very deep social revolution in Cuba.
So, in a sense, there was an element of deceit about his political program.
One can call that. He never defined his final ends. He does not consider that deceit because he did define the fact that he wanted a deep social revolution, and he did spell out many of the elements of that special revolution. But at the same time, he said before the revolution that he would seek a continuance of the 1940 Constitution. And of course, he never did that. So in that sense, you might say that he wasn't telling all to the people.
You explain in your book how almost immediately after the Bay of Pigs, the revolution was for the first time described, not only by Fidel but by others, as socialist. Can you recount how that happened and why that happened?
On the 15th of April, 1961, on the 15th of April, 1961, planes which had been sent by the CIA bombed several military airports in Cuba in an effort to destroy the Cuban Air Force, the small Cuban Air Force. This was the prelude to the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place 2 days later. Well, at the burial of the victims of the air raid, that is, on the 16th of April, Fidel Castro made a very, you might call it, anti-U.S. speech, describing the U.S. as the intellectual author of the attacks. And for the first time, he said, and we're going to build socialism right under the noses of the United States. And from that time on, the revolution was defined as Marxist. And since Fidel Castro was so popular and so many people fought in those days to defend the revolution, or at least took up arms to defend it, they decided that if Fidel Castro wanted it to go that way, they would also want it to go that way. There's another element. Many, many changes had been made from 1959 on. Real estate had been nationalized. Rents had been reduced to 10% of a family's salary. Medicines were reduced in price, and almost all major factories had been taken over by the government, and all foreign, especially U.S. Holdings, had been socialized. So, in effect, by the 17th or the 16th of April 1961, you had a socialist economy. The government controlled foreign trade, it controlled the banking system, it controlled just about everything. So, in fact, what Fidel Castro was saying in 1961 in April was, what we've had until now is socialist, and you've liked it, and let's put a name to it. Let's call it socialist, and let's call it Marxist-Leninist.
But it was some years more before Castro fully adopted the Leninist style of monolithic political party and reformed the Communist Party of Cuba.
From the beginning, there was a single source of leadership in the Cuban Revolution, and that was Fidel Castro and the people who followed Fidel Castro. Now, by the time Fidel Castro announced socialism, the Communist Party, which was called the Popular Socialist Party, had already pledged allegiance to Fidel Castro, as had a smaller group, the Student Directory. And so, in effect, there was a one-party system, but he very diplomatically sought to unite these three groups, and so he called the Communist Party, the new Communist Party, which was founded in 1975, So he called the new Communist Party, which was founded in 1965, an amalgam of the three currents. But the main current was definitely Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement.
You've got to know Fidel quite well. You've interviewed him a number of times. You're obviously respected by him. What are your personal impressions of Fidel? What sort of man is he?
I think that Fidel Castro is a romantic, extremely idealistic, a dreamer. At the same time, he's a practitioner of what they call realpolitik. He's pragmatist enough to make changes when they are absolutely necessary. And he has shown that he could make those kind of changes, but he likes to make the changes by his own rules, not because they were forced on him. I have found him to be an extremely charismatic person, one who is erudite in many, many fields. He can speak at length and in very specific, almost scientific terms about cattle, about general agriculture, about fishing, about underwater sports, about science, about medicine, about economics. He's extremely, extremely well-versed. He's really, in many ways, a kind of Renaissance man who has mixed intellectual life with a life of physical activity, and certainly has had the audacity to confront the most dangerous situations and to have faced death. I would say he's certainly one of the most important figures of this century.
He comes across to outsiders a little bit as a megalomaniac, very much the leader, a little bit of a cult of personality, very much in charge, not brooking dissent.
Fidel Castro has been in power for more than 3 decades, and it's very difficult for a man to have assumed such a central role in leading a nation without being seen as a megalomaniac, or certainly as a person who feels the call to power to be the leader of his people. And I think perhaps he is a man that has a great ego, but I think beyond that ego is a tremendous desire to change his country for what he sees is the better. He understands that if Cuba falls under the capitalist system, it will also fall under the sway of the United States, and he feels that would be the death knell of the Cuban nationality, of Cuba, as he sees it, of Cuban independence. And so socialism here has brought about national health care. It has given equal opportunity in education. It's done away largely with racial discrimination. There have been many, many achievements that he can point to, but right now, in the last few years, there are deep criticisms of the system. One of them is that there is not enough in the way of human rights, that is, freedom of people to express their views, freedom of opposition, elements to publish, to speak on the radio, and it is a unilateral type of leadership by a one-party system, and certainly this would lead one to believe that power is centralized in a single source. And so one could say that Fidel Castro, that the Communist Party here, holds on to monolithic power and will not allow opposition elements to develop.
You knew Che, I know. What sort of person was he?
Che was a person who was not as gregarious as Fidel Castro. He was extremely articulate, but in a more intellectual way. He was a man of tremendous principle, and he believed in living his principles. He had no patience with any kind of corruption, governmental or personal. In fact, there are many anecdotes. He had his family live on the regular ration of the average Cuban family, which was unusual because many of the leaders got special food supplies and so on for their families. When his mother came to Cuba to visit him from Argentina, he refused to let her use a state car. He told her to take a taxi because he felt it would be improper for her to use one of his state cars. He was that type of person. When he was out on a farm and they laid out a table for him to eat from. That is, they invited him to dinner. He insisted on eating just what everyone else did. He didn't like the idea of being served pork and having beer and so on, if other people couldn't have it also. So he was a person who was extremely true to his ideals, and I think he died that way, true to his ideals. And for that reason, he became a cult figure. Even in the Western world.
Just good.
About of departments and not only plain workers, but people with certain authority, send them out for 2 or 3 weeks to think about the errors they had made so that they'd straighten up.
How was he like to you, an American journalist?
Che was never anti-American as such. He'd speak a great deal about anti-imperialism. He was very much against the American policy at that time, foreign policy, which of course he had reason to, since the American foreign policy was devoted to undermining and destroying the Cuban Revolution. But on a one-to-one basis, he never expressed any dislike of Americans. In fact, he sometimes used an expression called, he's a good gringo, meaning he's a good American.
I get the impression from what you say that you rather admire both Che and Fidel in different ways.
Well, I think it's been a tremendously interesting life experience for me, an American, to have known both of them. As I say, I never was intimate friends with either of them, but both of them, I think, were bent on making a very profound social revolution. And if that revolution today is not all they thought it could be, it still, I think, was a step forward in mankind's quest for a better society, even if it's turned around. At some time, I think, people will recognize that many of the objects of the Cuban Revolution, such as social justice for all, are objects which all of us might want to seek in our own country someday, although by different means.
You were at Bay of Pigs during the mopping up operations. What did you see at Bay of Pigs, and what was the mood like when you went down to the area where the fighting had taken place?
Well, only a few days before the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro had announced that Cuba was building a socialist society, a Marxist-Leninist society, and had praised the Soviet Union for having helped Cuba with arms, although many of those arms did not arrive in time to be sent to the Bay of Pigs. Some tanks were taken off the boat. People were given 4 hours of instruction and went off to the Bay of Pigs to fight. But in general, there was a euphoric feeling after the victory. It only took 72 hours. And something which impressed me immensely is that as we drove down the roads lined by Cuban armed militiamen, they were giving the clenched fist salute. During that period, the International, which is the International Workers' Hymn, became number one on the hit parade in all of Cuba, and you would hear it everywhere. I was amazed with the rapidity with which the Cubans embraced this new system, which they did not see in European terms. They saw it as an outgrowth of their own very exciting cha-cha-cha Caribbean revolution.
And you saw some of the dead and some of the wounded at Tehran.
Yes, I was able to see some of the dead and wounded, including an American who had been shot down in one of the planes. The planes were piloted, the planes that came into attack, by members of the Alabama National Air Guard who had been hired by the CIA. And I did see the body of one of the pilots in a town called Agua Grande, very close to the front. And I also saw many young Cubans who had gone off to fight, black and white, for the revolution. It was very impressive. It was a small war, as wars go these days. It was not a high-tech war, no smart bombs, but certainly the Cuban people showed a tremendous allegiance to the Cuban Revolution, and that was the mistake, as recognized now, made by the CIA, that they thought that when they said, "Here we are liberators," they thought that they told the invaders that they would be joined by the Cuban militiamen, that they would throw down their arms and immediately join them, but just the opposite happened.
You were saying how the Cuban militiamen rallied to fight off the people at the time of Bay of Pigs. If you could imagine something similar happening today, would the nation rally in the same way, or has the glamour of the revolution been eroded?
I think the enthusiasm for the revolution reached its high point in the 1960s, and since then it's eroded somewhat. I don't think you would find the same almost unanimous support for the revolution. I found it to be extremely high in percentage terms. I would have estimated that time that 85% of the people supported the revolution. I don't think you would find anywhere that number today supporting it actively. I do think, however, it would either be a small majority or a very substantial minority who would support the revolution and fight for it. So the revolution still has the means to defend itself, and it still does have broad popular support, although not as much as it did in former days.
The special period, what effect has that had on Cuban living standards and on political attitudes?
The living standards of the Cuban people over the past year have gone down somewhat. 1968 and 69 and 70 were also low points in terms of the availability of food and services, but there's a difference. Today, Cuba no longer has the support of the Soviet Union. It's fairly isolated economically. It has a tremendous hard currency shortage. It's not bringing in enough money for its main product, export product, raw sugar. It has to buy oil at world prices on the foreign market. And all these things make the crisis much more profound, nor is it importing food as it did from Eastern European countries, from countries like East Germany and Bulgaria and the Soviet Union. So there are food shortages today. Life is austere. No one is starving. People still appear to be healthy. They are getting their medical care, but there's a shortage of variety. There isn't enough milk to go around, and medicines are also in short supply. So in general, life has become much more difficult for the average Cuban family. This has obviously had an effect on many Cubans. Many of them are judging the revolution today by its capability of solving this problem, and yet many don't see light at the end of the tunnel because there's no rich uncle who's going to bail them out.
Orientado hacia nuestras metas.